tell us is what a great soldier King Ahab was. In the 9th century, he gathered up a coalition of lots of little kingdoms like this all around Israel, and together they went out and beat the Assyrian army, that tremendous force from North Iraq that used to raid westward practically to the Mediterranean every year. It was King Ahab and his little coalition alone that stopped the Assyrians for a couple of years.
Anyway, Ahab and his friends certainly hadn't stopped the Assyrians for good. They kept on coming down into Israel year after year, just like a wolf on the fold, as they say, taking tribute and prisoners, destroying cities. And that, in 701 BC, was the sorry fate of the city of Lachish to the south of Jerusalem. Lachish must have been a hard nut for the Assyrian army to crack. These scenes celebrating the victory were taken from the central room, the very throne room of an Assyrian palace. And here's all the claustrophobia of hand-to-hand fighting. The ramps, the siege engines like funny tanks, the archers, the sappers, and the poor old Lachishites up their battlements fighting for their lives. In the Bible, the prophets bewail its fall. Here, as the people leave their city for the last time, they pass the elders of their town impaled, stretched out, flayed upon the ground. So here's Lachish's families with their laded carts, their women and their children, and a few pots and bundles. The eternal refugees with their carts leaving their land. The first time you'll see this scene in history. But it must have been a common enough sight at that time, on the roads that led eastward, from the cities of Israel and Judah to the lands of Assyria and beyond.
These were bad times. About 100 years after the kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians, Assyria itself was destroyed by a group of cities it had earlier conquered, led by that most ancient of all cities, Babylon. Of course, it didn't matter much to the little guys that lived around the edge. They were just dragged off in chains to Babylon rather than being dragged off in chains to Assyria. Well, about 586 BC, Jerusalem itself finally fell. The Old Testament tells us that its king Zedekiah was dragged from the city, his sons were killed, and then he was blinded. Then, of course, he would have been put in chains, along with his courtiers and his priests, the priests of the Temple of Jerusalem, the priests of Jehovah, would have been brought here and dragged down this great processional way. These, then, are the gates of Babylon, the very gates that swallowed up what was left of poor old ancient Israel. The great whore, the scarlet whore. The prophets call this city in their curses, and they call it that because here it was that Hebrew was almost forgotten as a spoken language. And here it was that some of the Judeans took up worshipping foreign gods. Now, it must have seemed to some of the other Judeans in their little ghetto in this huge city that their history, the history of ancient Israel, had come to a full stop. That Jehovah had created them, that they had lived, and then they had died. Their history then had become a finite thing. And they must have looked back over that history and seen that when they actually kept to the covenant, they did okay, that Jehovah smiled on them. But when they started to break the covenant and fall into sinful ways, their kings died, and finally their country was smashed and they were led into exile. And it seemed too that they needed to write this history down, all of it, in the light of this new experience. Because after all, it was a history of divine providence at work on earth. Now, most of these other little princes, when they come here in chains, have been told to bring the city gods, their country gods, with them. Now, the Judeans obviously couldn't have brought Jehovah. He wasn't about to be put in a box and carried anywhere. So they brought the temple treasures in Jerusalem, which the Babylonians put in their treasury. And they must have brought some sacred writings too, because the Bible, the Old Testament, actually mentions all these writings which were around in the time of ancient Israel. There were lists of laws talking about sacred books. There were histories, hymn books, all sorts of wonderful things. This it was that they would use to make their history, the history of this country, their country, which has somehow seemed to stop. They didn't want to write an archaeological history. They didn't want to write a scientific history. This was a sort of a summation of a nation. It was its last thing. It was its apotheosis. It was a divine history of this grand experiment between a God, a covenant, and a people. It had never happened before on earth. This was its memorial. Because here it was at Babylon that the Old Testament, or the greater part of it, was finally written down. Listen to this. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid. Now, listen to this. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. They're both, of course, poems by exiles. The last one, Psalm 137, written by an Israelite by the waters of Babylon. The other one, by W.H. Auden, English poet, September the 1st, 1939, just as the Second World War was breaking out. Now, that poem, as it goes on, the Auden poem, is full of very specific references. And you have to really know that the war is breaking out, and you have to know Auden, the young man in a foreign country, that he's deliberately chosen to leave. There's a whole set of literary references which make the poem really hum, and the more you know about them, the more the poem hums. Psalm 137, we know so little about those Israelites by the side of the waters of Babylon, that really the references we have can only be of the most general. Now, supposing Auden's poem had been written a couple of thousand years ago, and historians were trying to, make some sense out of it, put it all together. You can just see the word dive, for example. It caused terrible problems. Archaeologists would go to New York looking for diving boards on 52nd Street, or somebody would publish a street map of New York with a couple of graffiti that might have some special moral reference. That's the sort of condition we're into with the Bible. But there is, of course, one basic condition those two poems both share, and that really is a quality of nostalgia. Because the Old Testament, being put together after Israel's history, is looking back on ancient Israel, and it sees the land through somebody's mind's eye, through somebody's sad mind's eye. So you get visions of every tree and every stone of Israel as the scribes go for walks across its country and its pages. And every land purchase of Israel is delicately recorded. Every time, say, Abraham buys his burial ground from a Hittite, or Jehovah grants the land to the patriarchs, very carefully recorded. Huge genealogies to make sure that that careful recording comes right up to date. So if the exiles should return home, they would know exactly where their land was, the land they bought, the land they remembered. So, this exile has a most profound effect upon the Old Testament and its writing. They're looking back to see what went wrong with their contract with Jehovah. So they're remaking their own history. You get a slow slide. It's a tragedy from the high days when there's high morality and the slow slipping away from the covenant. And if you add that quality to the tremendous cultural contraction that must have happened in Babylon, the Jews fighting for their identity in this vast old city with lots of other little people all around them, then you get perhaps the basic ingredients of the Old Testament as you see it now. You get nostalgia, you get this absolutely rigid adherence to the idea of the race, the Israelite race, and you get also this tight examination of history and how Jehovah worked with it and how they have somehow fallen from grace. And that is why that early part of the Old Testament gives you this amazing romantic evening glow of history with heroes like Samson, with David and wise men like Solomon, all these fabulous people living in a fabulous long ago land.